Well, welcome everybody. This is the first session on the Grundlagen. I mentioned I think this is one of the paradigmatic works of philosophy. It's an example to us all in the clarity of the writing and the arguments. The J.L. Austin translation of it is superb. This edition of it has the facing German. I mentioned there's no place better to work on your philosophical German than Frege. Do get handouts as you come in. So, on the face of it, Frege's topic in the book is numbers. And you might come to that observation with disappointment, saying, well, I don't care that much about numbers. Why are they particularly philosophically interesting? And I actually, in the end, don't think that his account of numbers is the most interesting thing that's going on here. He uses it as an occasion to introduce new meta-concepts of object and concept. And that's what I think is really important in the first 60 sections or so of the Grundlagen. He is motivated to think about objects from the direction of numbers in a somewhat interesting way. For most people, well, anyway, most people since, numbers are sort of problematic objects. How is it that we get our minds around them? How is it that we can semantically think about them, given that they aren't physical objects? They aren't things we can causally interact with. But Frege starts off with the idea, the conviction on his part, that numbers are paradigmatic objects, that we should think about the other objects as not giving as pure a case as the numbers do of what an object is, precisely because we don't have causal interactions with numbers, which he thinks distract us and mislead us in thinking about what it is semantically to pick out an object. Anyway, that's what he needs to think hard about in the Grundlagen. Now, on the handout, I've started off with section 8 of the Begriffsschrift, which we didn't talk about last time when we were doing the Begriffsschrift. This passage, I've given you the entire section from the book. This is important for two reasons. It's his first try at describing the relation between objects and concepts. He's given us the notion of conceptual content at the beginning of the Begriffsschrift. That's mostly what we focused on. It's an inferential role notion. He says two judgeable contents have the same conceptual content, begrifflich Inhalt, just in case substituting one for the other. Well, he says in case when combined with the same other premises, they have the same consequences. That's equivalent to saying in case substituting one for the other in any good implication never turns it into a bad implication. I like that way of thinking about it because it assimilates it to the general form of noting invariance under substitution, which is the most fundamental Fregean methodology. So he'd already given us a notion of the conceptual content of sentences, and the most important part of this section from the Begriffsschrift is the very end. He says, we're talking about names, proper names, he says Eigenname, but he uses that to mean singular terms generally. I'll talk more about what other kinds of singular terms there are, but I think when he says Eigenname, we should think about it as meaning singular term, as including other expressions such as definite descriptions, for instance, as long as they in Quine's useful but potentially misleading phrase, purport to refer to just one object. That's one functional semantic characterization of singular terms. And he says the sign, the name, A and B have the same conceptual content, same term as before, so that we can everywhere put A for B, and conversely, well, of course we can substitute one for the other. What are we holding constant? Well, we're holding constant the conceptual content of the judgments that they're involved in. So at the top level, we have these implications, and we're going to assimilate sentences as having the same conceptual content in case substituting one for the other as a premise never turns a good implication into a bad one. And he said the conceptual contents that he aspires to codify are not just those of mathematical concepts, but also of the concepts of physics, geometry, but physics. At any rate, these implications are not going to be logically good implications. He's going to define logically good implications on down the line when he introduces logical vocabulary. The logically good ones are the ones that hold if substituting non-logical for non-logical vocabulary never turns a good implication into a bad one. Sorry. And then he's applying that same methodology again. If you think about the sentences embedded in an implication, and we pick one, well, we pick any of them, and substitute B for A everywhere in it. If it's a good implication, it never turns it into a bad implication. Then he's saying that the names have the same conceptual content. So he's using exactly the same methodology, assimilating things as having the same conceptual content in case substituting one for the other never turns a good implication into a bad one. So it's an inferential and substitutional way of thinking about the content. He also, however, in this passage, brings in the notion of what the objects referred to by the names are. And it's not clear what work that's doing. And he later on decided that what he'd said here was quite confused about it. This section should be laid alongside on sense and reference as the old view, the one that he held for a decade, which he'd come to realize was inadequate. I really don't think people should read on sense and reference except in conjunction with this passage. This is the first place we see what I described, I think, in my introductory remarks as a tension between two semantic models that he has in play. One of them is this inferential substitutional one, and the other involves truth, which I haven't had to mention in talking about his notion of conceptual content, even conceptual content of singular terms. Singular terms have the same conceptual content, not if they're intersubstitutable salva veritate, but if they're intersubstitutable salva consequentiae, that is, saving the consequences rather than saving the truth values. Now, when he defines logical implications, it turns out that being truth-preserving is sufficient to preserve consequences. But that's true for logical implications. It's not evidently true for all the implications, all the material, non-logical, pre-logical implications that articulate the contents of non-logical contents. But that invocation of truth goes along with thinking of the conceptual, with identifying the conceptual content of singular terms with the bearer that they have, the bearer of that name, the thing that is named by them. In his examples here, the points. So it's only later that it becomes clear that actually in some cases these two models push in different directions. But here it's all implicit, and you need to take what he says here with a grain of salt, in the sense that he later repudiated this view of the functioning of identity statements, and particularly his remarks that everywhere else we're talking about contents, but in identity statements we're talking about expressions. It can be worth thinking about exactly what he was after here, but given that he gave it up later, I'm not gonna pursue that. But insofar as he has anything to say here about the relation between them, he's taking for granted that if two names have the same bearer, then substituting one for the other never turns a good implication into a bad one. What Quine would later talk about as extensional occurrences of singular terms. Okay. He starts off asking about numbers, natural numbers, we would say, counting numbers. And he defines his topic in an interesting way right at the beginning. Numbers are answers to the question, how many? Here you could think about Anscombe thinking about a certain class of why questions, asking for the reasons somebody did something, and saying actions can be picked out, discriminated from mere movements, by the fact that the question why is always in order for an action. Why, in a sense that calls for a reason rationalizing the action. The question that really matters for Frege turns out to be, what is it that we ask the question, how many of? In the same way that Anscombe is asking, what is it that we ask the question why, in this distinctive sense that she has to delineate for us? What is it we ask that question about? And the answer there was actions, the thing that she was really interested in. Now, the answer to the question, what are we asking the question, how many of? What's that a question about? That doesn't evidently have anything to do with, anything in particular to do with numbers. It's something else. Ultimately, his answer is going to be concepts, is what we ask that question about. But getting to that answer is the result of the first real argumentation. Argumentation in, the first 40 sections or so. And he says, well, our naive answer to the question, what are we talking about when we ask the question, how many, is, well, anything. Anything. Any object, any particular, any entity. And he has in the background also the idea of how you get to an answer to a how many question. And that's by counting. By counting whatever it is that you're asking how many of. That's going to be our way into his new notion of object. His sharper notion of object is going to be objects are what you can count and therefore can give an answer to the question, how many? And we're going to understand numbers in terms of their role in answering how many questions, that is, in terms of their role in counting. there's an excuse for getting to this, to the point I'm about to make, only at the very end. And I do want to revert to it at the end. But let me jump ahead and say, downstream from Frege's argument in the Grundlagen, in Wittgenstein, who was a student of Frege's, not that he ever sat in a classroom with him, but he intensively studied the Grundlagen. By contrast to Carnap, who in 3 different years was actually sitting in Frege's classroom. I mentioned we have his incredibly detailed notes that he took from them in the Archive for Scientific Philosophy and the Carnap papers. Wittgenstein only talked to Frege once, when in 1911 he made a pilgrimage to Jena and went up the hill to Professor's Row in Jena, where Frege, confident of a substantial academic career, had bought a professor's house, a really gigantic house. He ended up an assistant professor emeritus, never really sort of lived up to that, but had this wonderful house. And Wittgenstein walked up from the inn, zum Bär, still there, and knocked on the door, and Frege answered it. It's 1911, he was born in 1849, so he was getting on a little bit. He was in his smoking jacket, and Wittgenstein said, "I'd like to see Professor Frege." And Frege said, "I'm Professor Frege." And Wittgenstein looked him up and down and said, "Impossible." He had a picture of who that had to be. This couldn't be used. So, not a student in the sense that they ever had philosophical conversations. That was not a great start for their conversation. But Wittgenstein studied this book intensively, and his response to it, you find some of it in the remarks on the foundations of mathematics, but this is implicit, at least implicit, in several of the discussions and the investigations as well, is what Hugh Price describes as a way of thinking about the later Wittgenstein's methodology, subject naturalism rather than object naturalism. This is a distinction Price makes in his Descartes lectures. He says an object naturalist says, look, I only understand things as specified in a naturalistic vocabulary. That might be a physicalistic vocabulary, maybe it's the ultimate vocabulary of fundamental physics, maybe I allow the vocabulary of the special sciences, maybe my naturalism is so relaxed that I say, well, any empirical descriptive vocabulary is okay. But lots of spooky stuff is not. But for me to think that your discourse is in order, I need to know that there's a naturalistically acceptable specification of what you're talking about, of the reference represented by your terms. I need to find them, place them, Frank Jackson's placement problems, I need to place them in a world described in my preferred naturalistic vocabulary. If you can't find them there, then I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand the meaning of what you're doing. That's object naturalism. And I take it, in general, that's a familiar sort of view. Wittgenstein says, well, suppose we're puzzled about a certain kind of discourse, and we're naturalists. I mean, that isn't a big thing. That isn't something that Wittgenstein makes a big deal out of, but it is, there is a broad sense in which he's a naturalist. He says, but if I can describe in a suitable naturalistic vocabulary the practices of using the vocabulary that's at issue. If I can say what you need to do to talk this way, and there's nothing mysterious about that description of your practices or the abilities that you need to exercise in order to do it, then if there are any residual naturalistic problems, that's your problem as a philosopher. That's not because this discourse is hard to understand in naturalistic terms. In particular, Wittgenstein claims, if there's nothing mysterious about practices of counting, if we can understand what people are doing when they're counting, if we can understand how you teach young ones to count, that tells us what we need to know about the use of numerals. From counting we can get the rest of arithmetic, easy to get addition and multiplication from that, and so on. He said, if we can give a suitable story about the language game of counting, how people learn to do that and what it is, then there shouldn't be any residual metaphysical puzzlement about the numbers that the numerals refer to or supposedly refer to. Maybe that referential model isn't the right model of their contentfulness, but it's enough on naturalistic grounds if we can say from the side of the subject what you need to do to talk number talk, to use numerals in their paradigmatic function as in counting. Now, Frege is going to say, if you understand counting well enough, then you understand everything about numbers. There isn't anything left over to understand. Now, he does think, probably by contrast to Wittgenstein, and certainly by contrast to Hugh Price, that the representational model applies absolutely here. That when you understand properly what you're doing in counting, you will understand what numbers are, what the objects that you're associating with numerals, what the objects those numerals refer to. You'll understand everything there is to understand about those objects. This subject naturalism, I think of as a form of pragmatism, because we're going from the activity of using the expressions to our understanding of the meaning. I can say in passing, my own version of this would be subject naturalism without the naturalism. That is, whatever vocabulary makes intelligible, properly intelligible, the use of the language, that's good enough. I mean, I actually think any such one will be naturalistic in a broad sense, but that is the word I want to fight over. The view that if you're trying to understand some vocabulary, if you can get an adequate understanding of the use of it, then if there's puzzles when you apply your semantic paradigm of name and bearer, let's say, to it, if you get puzzles, well, so much the worse for that semantic paradigm, because there can't be anything hidden if we really understand counting in this case. So that's a view we're heading for. So first conclusion that he gets right off the bat from defining the numbers he's after, the natural numbers, as the counting numbers, that is, as being responsive answers to the question, how many? Responsive answer, that's a jurisprudential concept. It's bracketing the question of whether the answer is true, is the correct answer, but it is, if it were true, it would be an adequate answer to the question. So if you say, well, how many pieces of paper are there on the desktop here, on the tabletop, and your answer is white, that's not a responsive answer to a how many question. Only numbers, only things you could use to count something are responsive answers to it. he says, the first thing you see from this is that 0 and 1 are equally good answers to the question how many as 5 or 17 are. As he says in one of the passages, if you ask, how many moons does Venus have? You've got to be prepared for the answer 0. It doesn't have any moons. Or about Earth, well, it's only got 1 moon. Those are good answers to the question how many. So whatever account we gave of numbers would have to apply to them as well. So people who think, well, numbers indicate a multiplicity. Well, does 0? What multiplicity does it? What about 1? Where's the multiplicity in that? Indeed, farther along, when we get into the second half of the Grundlagen, where he endorses Leibniz's strategy, these days when we talk about it, it's usually referred to as Hume's strategy instead of Leibniz's. That's largely Crispin Wright and Bob Hale have soldered that into the literature. He adopts his strategy of defining numbers by defining the particular number 1 and then defining number by appeal to increase by 1, to a notion of 1 more that he's going to find implicit in the activity of counting. If you do that and you want to get all the numbers, you better start with 0, not with 1, or you're not going to get 0 as a number. But he's willing to forgive Leibniz that and correct him for that. This is, by the way, why mathematicians index things always starting with 0 instead of starting with 1. If you're given a numbered list by a mathematician, it always starts with 0. So he's in a position to rule out of bounds as inadequate any account that is based on a notion of multiplicity, of there being more than one of something. But a more interesting view, whose historical resonances I'll talk about in a few minutes, is the idea that the number of things is a property of them. An example he uses later, we can ask, the botanist is equally interested in the color of the petals in the flower and the number of them. To say, well, they're yellow, and there's always 5 of them in whatever particular flower we're talking about. Those are just properties that the petals can have. They have a color and they have a number of them. Well, remember, he is thinking the crucial thing about the use of numerals, the vocabulary whose use we're trying to characterize, is counting. He's thinking of what's counted, what it is we're asking how many about, how many what. He's thinking of what we're asking for as a property of them. The way we ask, well, what color is it? I say he's thinking that those are the views he's addressing, his views that think of that. They say, well, there's a kind of unity that they have. His word is Einheit, oneness, we might say. That they have to hang together in some way. For them to be countable, they have to have this property of being one. There's alternative terms we could use. They have to be objects. They have to be things. But what kind of property, what kind of unity must a thing have? I think it's probably clearer to talk about particulars rather than objects, as what singular terms purport to refer to exactly one of. But what kind of property is being a one, having oneness, having the kind of unity in virtue of which we can count things? And here, a passage I think is on your handout from section 29. Does the number word one stand for, and Zahlwort, I'm saying numeral, does it stand for a property of objects? It must strike us immediately as remarkable that every single thing should possess this property. I said I'd talk in a minute about the historical resonances of this. A property that everything has, the medievals called a transcendental property. Scotus introduced the notion of hexiety as the individuality of a thing, a property that things have in virtue of being things. But isn't it immediately remarkable that every single thing should possess this property? It would be incomprehensible why we should still ascribe it expressly to a thing at all. It's only in virtue of the possibility of something not being wise that it makes sense to say Solon is wise. We need some contrast in order to have a notion of a property. Is the property dividing things into the ones that have it and the ones that won't? The content of a concept diminishes as its extension increases. So the content of mammal is smaller than the content of donkey. There's way more mammals, and you know less about them when you know that they're a mammal than you know about something when you know that it's a donkey. If its extension becomes all-embracing, then its content must vanish altogether. In isolation, it seems that one can't be a predicate, which expresses a property. This is even clearer if we take the plural. Whereas we can combine Solon was wise and Thales was wise into Solon and Thales were wise, it's a property they have, we can't say Solon and Thales were one. There's two of them. Two is how many of them there are. That's the proper answer to the question, not one. They don't have the property of oneness. But it's hard to see why this should be impossible if one were a property both of Solon and of Thales in the same way that wise is. Now, in a minute, we'll get to his diagnosis of sort of what's going wrong here. But this search for the property of unity, in virtue of which things are countable, is something you do from the object perspective, not from the subject perspective. If we think of object naturalism and subject naturalism, you're saying for it to be countable, it must have this property of Einheit. There must be a kind of unity that it has. From the subject perspective, we say, well, do we understand what counting is? Do we understand what that is? The right way to understand that turns out not to be that we're responding to a property that the thing has. Well, a property in a somewhat special sense of property that we'll get to in a minute. Everything is what it is and not some other thing was a slogan used to make fun of metaphysics. The question is how to make that true. How to understand that everything is what it is and not some other thing, so you can count it, and then use another, next count to count another thing. And He wants to say, well, thinking of it as a property in the sense in which, say, color is a property, or is wise is a property, that isn't going to do it. So look a little bit ahead in the development of the argument in the first half of the Grundlagen. He says it from section 34, every attempt to define one as a property having thus failed, we must finally abandon the view that in designating something a unit or a unity, we're adding to our description of it. By saying some property that it has, if it has other properties, we're already ascribing them to an object in the sense of accountable. But he considers at some length views, and I think one of the reasons he spends as much time as he does on it is because the great mathematician Dedekind talks this way. Says, well, we need a notion of unit because that's what we're counting, really, is units. How many units are there? And the trouble is, as Frege points out, the notion of unit, a thing that has unity, right? A one, we could say. When we think about that notion of unit, we're trying to combine identity and difference in a way that just looks paradoxical. There's a sense in which the units have to be identical and sort of interchangeable. You say, well, one unit and another unit make up two units. And you say, wait a minute, which unit did you pick? No, it's not supposed to matter. They're the same for these purposes of counting or adding. So he considers the Dedekind view, and this is, one could make the same complaint about, at any rate, an incautious interpretation of the Peano arithmetic axioms. So we've got a one, and then its successor is a one with a stroke, because we also need the units to be different, because if you put one unit together with itself, you don't get two. You have to put a different unit. So we mark the sameness by having the one there, and the difference by the number of strokes. But now he says, suppose I take the one with 3 strokes and add that to the one with 4 strokes. You're saying that's the same as the result of adding one with 1 stroke to one with 2 strokes? But those are completely different numerals that you've got, different units. This is section 36. The symbols 1 stroke, 1 and 2 strokes, 1 and 3 strokes tell the tale of our embarrassment. We must have identity, hence the 1, but we must have difference, hence the strokes. Only unfortunately, the latter undo the work of the former. It follows that on this view, Dedekind's view, there would not only be distinct 1s, but also distinct 2s, and so on. For 1 and 4 strokes and 1 and 5 strokes couldn't be substituted for, some other set of these things. So invocation of units, even with the addition of the idea of sort of succession, getting us a bit of the counting in there, still we don't even really know how to represent the things that we're assigning numbers to. So all of that is sort of ground clearing. These are the views that were extant among the mathematically minded people writing at his time, even the most distinguished mathematicians. Yeah, but they don't seem to offer a way forward. I think he mentions derisively in one place people invoking the Hegelian slogan of identity and difference. Yeah, right, but that would be explaining the obscure by the more obscure, would it not? If we can't get counting right, we're not going to get absolute spirit right either. So he said, but there is a way of thinking about this conceptual problem, and it's summarized and epitomized in section 45. Let me parenthetically remind you that last time I said one of the things you have to keep in mind in reading Frege is that he was trained as a mathematician, and he writes like a mathematician in the sense that he only says something once. In the way that a mathematician, if they give a definition of a concept or a construction, well, there it is, and you're supposed to look back to it. He's not going to repeat the definition every time. Frege, when he's making a claim, you only get it once. You don't conclude from the fact that he doesn't have later chit-chat about it that sort of it wasn't important because we only got. So in 45 he says, how are we to curb the arbitrariness of our ways of regarding things, which threatens to obliterate every distinction between one and many? Parenthetically, Wilfrid Sellars, in his list of canonical puzzles in the perennial philosophy, lists the problem of the one and the many as one of those. So, what does he mean by the arbitrariness of our ways of regarding things? And here, going on in, well, let's see, he's referring back to something he's talked about earlier in section 22. It's quite true that while I'm not in a position simply by thinking of it differently to alter the color or the hardness of a thing in the slightest, I am able to think of the Iliad either as one poem, or as 24 books, or as some large number of verses. If I give someone a stone with the words, find the weight of this, I've given him precisely the object he's to investigate. That if I place a pile of playing cards in his hand with the words, find the number of these, this does not tell him whether I wish to know the number of cards, or of complete packs of cards, or even of the honor cards in scat. Think bridge for Germans. To have given him the pile of hands is not yet to have given him completely the object he is here to investigate. The object, that is the thing that we're asking how many of. It's a little misleading to say object, because those are what there are that many of, is the object. I must add some further words, cards or packs or honors. The number 1, on the other hand, or 100 or any other number, cannot be said to belong to the pile of playing cards in its own right, but at most to belong to it in view of the way in which we've chosen to regard it. And I made a little chart here. It's silly, but one of the points of it is to look at the last line. When the objects we're talking about are numbers, what is the way of regarding it? What is sort of the sortal that goes with that distinctive kind of object? He's not asking that question here. He's going to worry about that later. But I would say the issue is this. You put the deck of cards or the mess of cards on the table and ask how many. And somebody says 1. And somebody else says 4. And somebody else says 52. And somebody else says 208. Now, those are all incompatible with each other, one is not equal to 4 or 52 or 208. Those are incompatible answers. Those people are disagreeing in the answer they give to the how many question. But what's going on here? Here I think the counsel of wisdom is the scholastic maxim: when faced with a contradiction, make a distinction. But in fact, Frege is filtering this through his generalization of the mathematician's notion of a function. I talked about this a little bit last time, saying where even in the middle of the 19th century, when mathematicians have made the transition from thinking about what they're doing in a calculational way to thinking about it as, in a phrase Dedekind picks up and uses, denken in Begriffen, thinking in concepts rather than just calculating, still they thought of functions as taking numbers as arguments and values. And then we could sort of generalize from the model of numbers. But they understood functions in terms of numbers. If you talked about a function that assigns to each plant the seed from which it grew, they would treat that as metaphorical. Whereas for Frege, that's a real function. Frege understands numbers in terms of functions instead of the other way around. And that is radicalizing that understanding. What he sees is, we got a function here, and we say the value of f is 1 person. And another one says, no, the value of f is 4. Another says, no, the value of f is 52. No, it's 208. Those are all contradictory, but if f is a function, we can reconcile that by saying, well, they have different arguments. Those are the values of the function f for different arguments. So this is a generalization. The scholastic maxim says, well, make a distinction. Well, he's seeing a hidden argument here. There's a hidden relativity of the answer to the question, how many, a relativity of the appropriate counting to something. This is really a side remark, but because we're going to be talking about arguments and so on, don't make the mistake of treating parameter as synonymous with argument. Arguments and parameters of functions are quite different in, E equals mc squared. E and m and c are arguments, and the 2 is a parameter. We can think of it as relative to, well, are you sure it isn't emc cubed? That's the parameter in it. It's sort of a coefficient of the function rather than the variables in the function that are the arguments. So that's just a side point. Frege is interested in substituting for parameters or coefficients as well as for arguments, that is treating a different part of the expression as variable, and so getting higher order concepts. Okay, that's just a bit of terminological fussiness. This is okay. So what can we say about this missing argument? The one that gets filled in, that gets indicated by saying, no, I mean decks or cards or suits or corners of cards. That argument gets filled, and we want to know, well, what kind of thing is filling that in? And he says, it better not turn out that it's just a matter of my idea, of my subjective preference when I say, oh, well, I'm thinking of Dax. Because statements of number can be objective matters of fact. There's a fact of the matter about how many moons Jupiter has, or how many petals a black-eyed Susan flower has. If we're going to make sense of the if we're going to reconcile the relativity of number claims to something, that something can't be just arbitrary subjective whim. It's got to be something objective. And here, yeah. Here, there are two, here's what he says about objectivity. This is back in 26. The objectivity of the North Sea is not affected by the fact that it's a matter of our arbitrary choice which part of the water on the Earth's surface we mark off and elect to call the North Sea. You think about the North Sea, all right. The Kattegat between Denmark and Sweden, yeah, that's a sort of natural boundary, but when you get over to the English Channel or, going up around Norway, there isn't, there are many choices that you could make. But he says, but don't think that because that's true, that we have different ways we could use the expression North Sea, that it isn't an objective thing that you could drown in if you go out in bad weather in it. It's an objective part of the Earth, even though there's room for you and me in talking about it to actually draw the boundaries differently. Now, that seems like an obvious claim, but it's actually harder to make sense of than you might think. Here's a way to see some options. If you pick any two things, I'll say, we don't know what those are yet, they're similar to each other in an infinite number of ways. There are an infinite number of properties we can find that they share. This will include quite gerrymandered properties that are hard to express, but we can generate, for any set of properties you give that they share, we can generate more of them. And they're dissimilar in an infinite number of ways. If we want to say that some things really are more similar to each other than other pairs of things are, we have to privilege some of those respects of similarity or dissimilarity somehow. My Dr. Vater Rorty says privilege, normative notion, it's a social notion. The only thing that can pick some of these out as opposed to others is their relation to our practices, to our interests. That's the fundamental pragmatist idea, that the only way to distinguish some of these respects of similarity and dissimilarity, to entitle yourself to focus on them, is to think about their relation to us. Ultimately, some of them matter more to us. Ontologists, like my other Dr. Vater, David Lewis, says, no, there have to be objectively privileged respects of similarity, ones that are natural where other ones are not natural. A paradigmatic natural property is the number of eyes you have. A paradigmatically non-natural property is having eyes the same color as the oldest current inhabitant of Provo, Utah. That's sometimes called a Cambridge property. That changes as soon as that inhabitant dies or moves away. Suddenly you don't have that property anymore. That's not a natural property. There have to be some. But now, what do you mean by saying, no, nature really does have joints? Some of those infinite respects of similarity are objectively natural in a way that are objective in a way that the rest of them are not, and similarly for the respects of dissimilarity. Frege, I think, in this remark about the North Sea, is saying those are both extremes that we should avoid. The North Sea is an objective thing, even though there is this relativity to our practices of drawing boundaries around it. But you shouldn't conclude with the pragmatists that there's, anyway with pragmatists like Rorty, that there's nothing objective about the North Sea because it's up to us how we draw a boundary around it. Nor should you, I think implicit in this, nor should you deny that there is room for us to contribute in drawing boundaries around the North Sea as we talk about it, in a way that need not, picking one of them need not commit you to saying the other ways are objectively wrong. No, that's not the North Sea. You've gotten the boundaries of it wrong. I mean, maybe some of them really aren't getting the North Sea. It needs to include at least some of what we've traditionally called the North Sea. But you don't, even though two of them are incompatible, they draw different boundaries, you needn't claim that there's an objective fact of the matter about it. But as I think these sort of sophisticated, if admittedly extreme, sort of subjective on the side of the subject, the pragmatists, and on the side of the objects, the ontologists, the metaphysicians, as the possibility of those views shows, entitling yourself to say what Frege is saying, look, this is surely just common sense thing to say about the North Sea, that it's an objective thing, look, it's right out there, see the waves, and so on. Its objectivity is not impugned or undercut by the fact that we have some leeway, we have some authority to draw the boundaries one way rather than another. How do we entitle ourselves to that? How are we going to do that? Well, that's what he needs to do in order to curb the threat of to curb the arbitrariness of our ways of regarding things. So one of his other examples is the number of Jupiter's moons is 4. I think now the official answer is 79, and the 4 are just the Galilean moons. But again, we have a certain leeway in whether we call Pluto a planet or not, whether we say that some of the dust that's out there, do those count as moons? We could make different decisions about that, as we have with Pluto. It doesn't make Pluto any less objective that we have the leeway to decide whether it's a planet or only some extrasolar object. But what I think we're seeing is it's not trivial to entitle yourself to talk in that sensible and natural way. So Frege asks, well, what then can the arguments of this function, the missing argument when we ask how many, we say, well, how many what? We need to fill in the argument for the function there. And he says, and it can't just be something that varies with the whims of the subject who's answering or even who's asking. He says, well, really, it's a concept. That's what we need to supply. Now, you might say, well, aren't concepts in our mind? No, Phrygian concepts aren't. Think of this as a commitment he's making, a criterion of adequacy that his new notion of a concept has to satisfy. Just as his new notion of an object has to satisfy various constraints, anything countable is an object. That's going to be one of his constraints, because that's what answers the question, how many? Well, he's saying there's this extra argument placed, there's a function, that function that fills in the how many question, those are concepts. And, promissory note going forward, concepts we can understand in a way that is compatible with it being an objective matter of fact, whether a certain concept applies to a certain object or not. So it can be an objective fact whether the concept yellow applies to the petals, a different kind of fact, but it can be an objective fact that there are 5 petals relative to that concept. Okay. Well, that's what I think happens in the first half of the book, first third of the book, maybe I'll say, because his next move is to realize that not just any concept will do. For instance, the concept red won't do. You can't count red things. Is the bottom half of a red thing a red thing? Is the non-facing side, but still it's red, of a red thing, is that a red thing? Only certain concepts will do. It's that leads people to want to talk about units, or the kind of unity that something must have in order to be countable. But Frege is now saying, well, think about which concepts can fill in that argument place in a how many case. Green is a concept, but it's an attributive concept. The concepts he cares about, this is now section 54, I think this is on the handout. The proposition asserting that units are isolated and indivisible can accordingly be formulated as follows. Only a concept which isolates what falls under it in a definite manner, and which does not permit any arbitrary division of it into parts, can be a unit relative to a finite number. Well, if we think about predicates, and remember he's already used that term when he said number isn't a property expressed by a predicate in the way in which color or weight are, because it doesn't isolate what falls under it in a definite manner. A concept like dog does. Those are sortal concepts, as opposed to attributive concepts. This language is more or less due to Quine. Not that he was the first to use these terms, but he's the one who solidified this usage in word and object. And here's the key thing that Frege realized, but let me put it in the Quinean terminology because I find it more illuminating. Every predicate has what Quine calls criteria of application. There's some circumstances under which it's appropriate to apply the term, and other circumstances where it's not. That's true of red, that's true of dog. They have criteria, or I'd prefer to say circumstances of appropriate application. Criteria sounds like it needs to be explicit. Criteria sound like things you need to be able to state. The popularity of the notion criterion is due to Wittgenstein, and I don't think Wittgenstein used it in a way that implied that it could be made explicit, but talking about the circumstances of appropriate application. We could say what has to be true of something for the predicate to apply, for it to count as having the property. That was one sort of qualification of the criteria of application of what I'm calling merely attributive predicates. Another one is, you shouldn't only look upstream to where it's appropriate to apply the term. You should also look downstream to the consequences of doing that. Frege only looked at the consequences of things when he was defining begrifflich Inhalt, but I suggest you ought to look at the antecedents of them too. If you think about criteria or circumstances of application of the predicate, you're only looking upstream to where it is appropriate applied, not downstream to what follows from applying it. And these two can come apart. A simple case is if I say, for most of my life I used the example, I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel, and I will write a book about Hegel. Now I actually wrote a book about Hegel, so it's a less appropriate example, but at least suitably regimented notions of foresee will give those the same circumstances of appropriate application. When I'm entitled to make the prediction, I can also, as it were, report being entitled to. I foresee that I will, and I will. But they have quite different consequences of application. If I will write a book about Hegel, it follows I will write a book about Hegel. That doesn't follow from I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel. Lots of people have foreseen that they would write books that they did not, in fact, write. The circumstances and consequences can come apart. When they do, we say, in this case, they don't have the same truth conditions. But that's a way, in this case, of talking about the consequences. So nothing is going to turn on this for the discussion of Frege. I'm just registering that just as I'd rather talk about circumstances than about criteria, so as not to prejudge the sort of explicitness of it, it might be really hard to formulate a rule that said when you could apply, for instance, red to something. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have relatively definite circumstances of application. And if we're talking about the content of attributive adjectives or attributive predicates, you should look downstream to consequences as well as upstream. It matters not just what things you call red, but that it follows from its being red, that it's colored, that it's visible, and so on. Okay. But there are other concepts. All these predicates, all these adjectives, picking out some kind of property, have, I'll just say, criteria of application. But some, in addition, have criteria of identity and individuation. And those are the sortals. It makes sense to ask when we apply the sortal dog. I say it's a dog rather than just saying it's brown. Is this the same dog as that? And the criteria of identity will tell us when it's the same dog. Maybe we trace their careers through space and time until they intersect somewhere and say, yeah, that's the same dog. Criteria of identity and individuation. When are they different dogs? We've got to be able to tell that as well. Often these are run together, criteria of identity and individuation. That's Quine's slogan. But you can imagine having criteria that will tell you infallibly if these are the same dog. But not all the cases where it doesn't tell you infallibly that they are cases where they're not. And maybe you have another criterion for telling you infallibly that they're not, but there's a gap in between. I should say that example I gave in epistemic terms, you telling, but what we care about and what Frege is careful about is it's a semantic question. It has to be settled. These criteria of identity and individuation have to settle in each case when two of them are the same dog and when they're different dogs, or it's not a well-formed concept, not one that he's going to allow. You can't do that for red. If I say, is this the same red as that? Well, I could only be asking about shades of red, not, as it were, red things. Because red doesn't come with criteria of identity and individuation that lets you count red things. That's why dog isn't an adjective. It's a noun. It's a common noun. It has not only criteria of application, but criteria of identity and individuation. Now, there's an adjective associated with it, is a dog, that is just an attributive property. That's if you just focus on the criteria of application of it. Is a dog doesn't itself require you to be able to answer the question, is it the same dog as that other one? I don't know that, I just know it's a dog. That's something that can be settled, even if you can't settle the identity and individuation of the dogs. Yeah, they were running around here, and I don't know whether it was 2 or 3 dogs, whether this one was the same, but I know it was a dog. That's a position one can be in. So any sortal concept is going to have an associated attributive concept. Is a dog rather than dog. But it's because it's a sortal concept that you can count dogs. What he's looking at is, what are the presuppositions of counting under a concept? Well, to count, you got to be able to tell. So I count whatever it is I'm counting. Here's 1, 2, 3. Now the next one, is this the 4th one, or is this one of the 3 that I've already counted? In order to answer the question, how many of whatever this is I'm talking about, the next one that comes up, do I give it the next number, or do I pass it over because it was just one of the ones I already counted showing up? How many dogs are there in the pen? I'm counting them and they're moving around. I've got to be able to identify, tell when I've got the same dog, so I shouldn't increment the count, or got different ones, so I should increment the count. The minimal condition of counting is being able to identify and individuate whatever you're counting. I'll use a capital K as the variable for these, meaning kind, because kind terms are among these terms. Quine usefully points out, and again this is his term, that among nouns that are general rather than singular terms, there are also mass nouns, like water or gold. You can't count water or gold. You can count pieces of gold. You can count cups of water. But you need some classifier. You need some way of singling things out that come under them if you want to count them. Mass nouns you can measure with a unit. Now this is a different sense of unit than one we were talking about, but you can talk about how many pounds of gold we have. The answer to that is not going to be a how many, it's going to be a how much answer. That's not what Frege is concerned with, he's told us. But much as we can get an adjective that goes with a sortal predicate, we can often form sortals from mass nouns. Okay, you can't count coffee, but you can count cups of coffee. Those can actually be counted, not just measured. That's a classifier that we use. Now, Quine also talks about, and I have only his authority for this, Japanese classifiers in the Japanese language, where at any rate, a great number of things function as mass nouns and take different classifiers, which permit you to count them. You use a different classifier for flat, thin things, like pages of a book or leaves of a tree or blankets. The construction, so he says, is like piece of, but it's flat, thin piece of these things. And a different classifier for sharp, pointy things, like pencils and chopsticks. Those use a different classifier in order to get sort of countable things for them. So that, as Quine tells the story, many, if not most, of the sortals in Japanese have this different grammar, where there's a term that acts like a mass noun and calls for a classifier in order to produce a sortal, whereas those are much less common in English or German, for instance. So Frege is opening up this topic, really, of the different kinds of properties or the different kinds of concepts that there could be. For him, a concept is something you can apply to singular terms to get a judgeable content about it. There's different kinds of concepts, and one crucial difference is the difference between sortal concepts and merely attributive concepts. And we can begin to explore that terrain by thinking about how those concepts interact with mass nouns with classifiers of various kinds. Some classifiers with mass nouns you only get real numbers or rational numbers. You're measuring rather than counting. If you want to know how many pounds that is, the answer could be 2.277. That's a different a sort of classifier that gives you a measurement rather than a count. And here we're worried about the count, but in general, we'd like to know, well, what do counting and measuring have in common? The Japanese classifier example suggests, well, it doesn't have to do with just numbers. These classifiers can give us things that you can count, starting with things that don't look like mass nouns, like pointy things. As I say, I can't speak for the truth of that, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter. There could be a language that worked like that, regardless. Here's a fact Frege didn't know. It was only painfully won by developmental psychologists who, misled by our buddies, the British empiricists, thought that the concepts that kids learn first and should be easiest for them are like color concepts and shape concepts. After all, that's what the buzzing, blooming confusion of their visual field consists in, right? No, those are really hard concepts for kids to learn. They are by no means the ones they learn first, and this is a very robust result. What's really easy for them to learn is concepts like cat and dog. And coming with that is this the same dog as that? They get that before same color or red. This, as I'm about to suggest, is grist for Aristotle's mill, who says, well, what there is in the world is substances. And substances, it's true, come with some properties. We're seeing substances as picked out by sortals, and they also have attributes, right? There are adjectives that go with them. The ones that are part of the criteria of application that go with the criteria of identity and individuation of substance sortals are essential properties of them. And the property, so, being a mammal, of being a dog, that's an essential property. It's part of the criteria of application of that sortal concept, whereas being brown is just a property a dog might or might not have. That's not an essential property, it's an accident of it. But the world comes to begin with as substances with their various essential and inessential attributes. That was a vision that was a sort of vision of the world that took as its paradigm of sort of the way the world comes, things individuated by substance sortals. Water and gold get in there too, but those are not the paradigms of Aristotelian substances, which are, kinds of living things. That's where we're starting from. And influenced by Aristotle, early modern philosophers like Descartes, but think especially of Spinoza, substance is an absolutely crucial concept for them. Substance is what's sortalized. Substance is their word for what sortals apply to. And the early moderns were really concerned about this. You identified and individuated things by substances with their essences and accidents. That was how you did it. Kant says, well, that was fine when your paradigm of scientific understanding was Aristotelian biology, traditional biology. But my paradigm of understanding is Newtonian physics. And we Newtonians identify and individuate things not by substances with their essences and accidents, but spatiotemporally. What is their position in space and time? That's what individuates things. And to a first approximation, that's the way we've done it ever since. Which you can see, let's just talk about space. So if two things are at one time, if two things are in different places, then they're different things. Maybe there can be coincident objects, maybe not. Coincident object, the lump of clay and the statue made of that clay, maybe two things can be in the same place at the same time, but if they're at different places at the same time, they're definitely different objects. In any case, the basic structure of individuation of things in Kant's nature is by space and time, by location in space and time. Which, if you notice, that's a mass term, space. There's regions of space. Similarly, for time, we need classifiers to get something that we can count, for instance, that we can individuate things. We need some classifiers to do that. What did Kant have to say about that? The transcendental aesthetic is about that, and about how space and time are, on the one hand, different from the concepts that have extensions that we can count and so on, different from sortal concepts like electron or point mass. But they're essential to individuating the objects that we apply the other concepts to. How do we think about that? Well, he's got a faculty thing. We need to look at sensibility as well as understanding. Okay, but I'm suggesting a way of thinking about what the problem is that's a response to. It's part of this revolutionary move that he made from thinking about the identity and individuation of things in Aristotelian substance terms to thinking of them in spatiotemporal terms, which is absolutely essential if you're going to find things in the world of the physicist. If you're going to find the dogs there, thinking about them as in terms of the regions of space and the periods of time that they occupy is going to get you farther than looking for the substances. He has other, later on, has other complaints about the substance concept. But basically, downstream from Kant, you didn't think about these sortals. Now, Frege is downstream from him, and he does. But Bertrand Russell's version of Frege's logic, which Russell thought was just a clarified version of Grundgesetze, Macbeth is the prophet teaching us the many ways in which that's absolutely not so. But it is true that if you throw away enough of Frege, what's left is Principia. It is a consequence of what he does, but he's doing something richer. But in what Sellers calls PMEs, Principia Mathematica, logistical language, there aren't any sortals. There's just predicates. Universal quantifiers quantify over things. What are those that have the property of unity? Well, to do the logic, you don't need to know. If we want to say, well, I'm just saying that all dogs are mammals, then you have a for all x. If x is a dog, then x is a mammal. But we only use the attributive adjectives. Is a dog, is a mammal. There's no sortals in the picture. Well, how do things get individuated? Frege is really concerned about that. Russell isn't at all. He just says, well, it's the things. And that attitude gets operationalized in Tarskian model theory, whose prophet is Quine. He's the one who philosophically interpreted it for us. And he says, well, that's a matter of the domain of the model that you're talking about. Tarski himself didn't, until very late, 15 or 20 years after he introduced the model theory, before he thought about models that had different domains. For Tarski's model theory, you picked a domain, a set of objects about which all that matters is they be merely numerically distinct. You have to be able to count them. And then we can do everything with them. We use them as the domain of quantification to model theoretically interpret it. Yes, but under what concept are they individuated? What is the sortal? And Quine and later Tarski, in effect, outsource that to a more expressively powerful semantic meta-vocabulary in which you're specifying the models. That is, they punt. They don't answer that question. I mean, this is tempting again. When I asked, what is it you're counting? You're being asked to count with a how many question. How many? And now we say, well, what kind of thing is it that it's appropriate to ask how many of? And we're seeing Frege's answer is, well, you need to supply a sortal concept, one that has criteria of identity and individuation, because those are exactly what has to be settled to make counting unambiguous. So there's a correct answer to the counting that's settled. Sameness, criteria of identity, difference, criteria of individuation. You've got to be able to do both those things. You might have been tempted when I asked, well, what is it that we're asking how many of? To say, well, the elements of a set. Now, sets are perfectly good objects. We know how to identify and individuate them. Two sets are identical if they have all the same elements. Oh, but set theory doesn't tell us anything about the identity of the elements. That's outsourced to some other sortals that are no business of set theory. So to answer, well, it's the elements of a set that you count, isn't to give an answer to Frege's question. It's just to put off the question so that the relevant sortals are off stage somewhere. Yeah.
This is kind of a basic question because, so one thing that I found interesting when you talk about units of measure is it makes sense to say how many liters, right, or how many pounds. But am I supposed to think of liter or pound as a sort of concept? Because it doesn't seem to have such clear criteria. Is this the same?
Well, it doesn't. As I say, the answer to that question, how many pounds or how many kilograms, could be 2.783. So not a natural number, not a counting number. Those classifiers only get you to measure, not to count. Now, where measuring is how much, where the answer can be a rational number, a real number. Maybe it can't be, well, anyway, in electrical engineering, the answer can be a complex number. But different notions of measurement are going to allow a different range of things, not necessarily numbers. Davidson at one point conceptualizes what the job of his radical interpreter is when I'm trying to assign meanings to your words and attribute beliefs and desires to you. Problem. I'm using my attitudes and meanings to measure yours. What are your beliefs specified in the measurement system provided by my beliefs and meanings. I think he doesn't go as far as one ought to go in explicating, in working out that metaphor, that analogy. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying he doesn't do it. He suggests that something is an exercise to the reader. Okay, well, I'm sort of in the middle of the historical story, but if I get to the end of it, we're not going to get a break. So let's take 15 minutes now. It's 2:35. Let's come back at 2:50. Okay. Well, I wanted to talk more about the history here because it seems to be a paradigm. People have been thinking about these transcendental concepts, unity, being, that things had to have, that Frege is like a breath of fresh air, saying, well, you're talking about what's required for accountability. Let's think about what is presupposed by the ability to count, by the possibility of counting, identity and individuation, distinguish sortal concepts from merely attributive concepts, and we've seen it's more complicated than that. But that the context this took place in was a substance ontology that started with sortals and made the sharpest distinction between sortal concepts, which are common nouns, by contrast to a kind of term, a general term, by contrast to singular terms, but don't belong in a box with the adjectives, the properties of them. It's the essence of the Aristotelian approach to distinguish those things. And so if we think about sort of the substance concept in terms of sortals, I think it makes it possible to see a lot of things in the texts of these early moderns and the Aristotelians before them that otherwise are invisible. And in particular, it underscores how revolutionary Kant's shifting from that whole way of thinking about individuation to thinking in terms of spatial and temporal regions as the crucial individuative things. This leads Kant down a bit of a bad road, a bit of a bad path, though. He ends up, saying, well, what is the source of particularity in the end? Well, it's intuitions, which are particular, but there's no sortals that go with them. Or anyway, the story about their identity and individuation, goes through spatiotemporally schematizing conceptual categories. This is the messiest and least successful part of that bit of the first critique, but there weren't any sortals for him. I think, sort of scholarly side note, the person who made the most of this as a revolutionary move that Kant made, I think, is Ernst Cassirer. That's where I learned it. The way I learned to think about this way was from Cassirer. He does it in a very interesting context. It's in the context of what I think is his most interesting book, though I haven't read all of them, Substance and Function, about a shift from thinking in terms of substances to thinking functionally, not in Frege's sense of function, but in the sense of sort of Putnamian functionalism. Think about the role something plays in other things, in some system of relations and maybe operations. And he uses as an example of the sort of conceptual sea change that he's talking about, from thinking in terms of substance to thinking in terms of function. The development of biology in the 19th century in Germany from anatomy, thinking in terms of the structure of living things, which is what Linnaean botanization, Linnaean classification was exclusively anatomical and so structural. The shift from thinking in terms of anatomy to thinking in terms of physiology, thinking in terms of the functions, nutrition, reproduction, and so on, which was thinking sort of functionally, what role in these different processes that living things engage in does an organ play or a cell play, thinking about those functional roles and giving only a subsidiary, attributing only a subsidiary significance to the anatomy, because some of the anatomy mattered functionally and others of it didn't. They say the classification should only be in terms of physiologically significant anatomical differences, and that basically gave everything over to the physiology. That's sort of his test bench, his test case for this transformation from categories of substance to categories of function. But he's a Kant scholar and invokes Kant in this regard. Now, I think, but I'm not sure about this, that the first one who actually saw this about Kant, that he had shifted the framework within which identity and individuation was thought about to the spatiotemporal Newtonian from the Aristotelian categories. I think it was Frege's teacher, Kuno Fischer, who first came up with this. I don't know, Anwar, do you happen to know? He was the one who first read Kant as, above all, a philosopher of science, and said you've got to think of him in those terms. And I think this was one of his observations. This matters because that's who Frege learned his Kant from, was Kuno Fischer in Jena. And Fischer was also the father of the Neo-Kantian philosophical movement in Germany. He's the one who coined the phrase "Zurück nach Kant," back to Kant. That's that is, forget all that Hegelian nonsense and be sensible and go back to Kant. So I was talking about Bertrand Russell as sort of the bad guy here, but is Kant a bad guy? He was picking up this Kantian theme, which was pushing Sortles out of view. But Russell also was in the forefront of, articulating the ontological reading of these things. When he says, the most fundamental divide among metaphysicians is whether they think the world at base is like a bucket of shot or a bowl of jelly. So the shot he's talking about is shotgun pellets. So they're identified and individuated. You've got a bucket of them. You're going to be able to count them. There's some number of them. Whereas if it's a bowl of jelly, well, that's what becomes a gunk world in contemporary metaphysics, where you can subdivide ad libitum. There is no smallest item, and Russell saw the way forward as atomism. He didn't see Frege as speaking for the importance of sortles and identifying and individuating things. That just went right by him. He thought the big thing about Frege's view was that he'd moved us from thinking about predicates in one way to thinking about them in another way. That is, he moved us from thinking about monadic predicates, just properties, to thinking about relational ones. And that wasn't just Russell. Peirce called what he was doing a logic of relations as well. So, move to the polyadic predicates. Well, that was an important move. There's no question about it. But those are still just attributive predicates or properties, though they're relational. There's nothing. They're not sortals. They're not individuating these things. If you're going to be an atomist, you've got to worry about what the ultimate sortals are. When you're counting the shot in the bucket of shot, what are you counting? And I think it is characteristic of analytic metaphysics to do its individuation by finding the ultimate sortals. For my teacher, David Lewis, he says, well, he doesn't know what the ultimate particles are, but physics will find them. Whatever the ultimate particles are, and the physicists will individuate them, that's what there is, really, fundamentally. And in a slightly more, in a slightly looser sense, any mereological sums of those fundamental particles, those are also real and can be individuated. It's an embarrassment for people who take that particular view that no actual kind is the mereological sum of anything, since mereological sums don't care where spatiotemporally the particles are. It's the same mereological sum, however you move the particles around. Everything, all the work needs to be done by the arrangements of them. But anyway, there's a strategy and a way of thinking about metaphysics as saying, among all the sortals we could have, there's an ultimate set such that this is rock bottom, these criteria of identity and individuation, and the things that you can count under them. And everything else real must be, the sortals that you use for it must be constructible in some licit way from these fundamental sortals. And as Lewis pursues this metaphysical project, and I think of Rorty's voice in my other ear saying, yeah, but you can define some sortals in terms of others, and then maybe you could define these in terms of these others. What makes you think that there's some privileged order of understanding some of them in terms of others that deserves this honorific? No, that's what's real. At any rate, I recommend thinking about contemporary analytic metaphysics in terms of criteria of identity and individuation, sortals, and so coming up with Fregean objects. Yeah. Okay, yeah, go ahead, John.
So it sounds like the picture we're painting is one where Frege has a metaphysical view where it doesn't really make sense to talk about objects unless you classify them under some sortal. And at the same time, I thought that Frege's formal logic will allow you to say something like, there exists X, and there exists Y, and there exists Z, such none of these are identical. And that seems to say like there are three objects without classifying them under a sortal. And in fact, this, and Frege has to count this as true, is going to be a logical consequence of things you accept. And it seems like, well, that's true. What makes it true on this metaphysical picture we're painting?
Yeah, so, I mean, famously, Phrygian quantifiers are wide open. I mean, insofar as they're quantifiers, his sign of generality, and that really is over everything that can be referred to by a singular term. I say they're not quite quantifiers because you can put functional terms and concept terms in the concavity also. It applies to them even though there are no singular terms that refer to them. This is the concept and object stuff. But yeah, notoriously his quantifiers range over everything, and what does he mean by that? Well, thereon hangs a tale. Here's a gesture in the direction. So the one who accuses Frege of having these ultimately unintelligible quantifiers because they quantify over everything, most tellingly is Peter Geach in reference and generality. And that's where he uses Phrygian arguments from this book to argue against absolute notions of identity, saying you can't ever say that X is identical to Y and be making a definite claim. You have to specify the sortal with respect to which you're identifying them. And he says that matters because different sortals can give you different identity conditions. So in the example that has come to loom large in the vast literature on this topic, airlines publish figures about how many passengers they flew in a month or in a year. US Airways flew several billion passengers last year, more than there are people in the world. How is that? Well, if I fly to New York and then fly back, I count as 2 passengers, even though there's only 1 person there. So, the passengers are more finely individuated than the people are. If you point to me as I'm sort of in the jetway and say, well, but is that the same as, and now there's another me in the jetway? Well, there isn't an answer to that, Geach-wise. He says it's the same person, but not the same passenger. And it follows from this that because things that are identical to the same thing are identical to each other, neither of those passengers can be identical to me, the person. They're not identical to each other, which proves that passengers are not people, which sort of explains why they treat us the way they do in the airlines. No, that's it. I'm just saying that we deserve that from deep logical principles, Geach says here. Geach's favorite example is, he's writing this in the 60s as the conservative that he is, men and surmen. But let's talk about people and surpeople, where surpeople are people but individuated by their surnames. So everyone who has the same last name that you do is the same surperson as you. And again, to say that these two are the same surperson as you are is not to say that they're the same person. So if we ask, is this the same as this? No answer until we've given a sortal to it. And because of that, Geach says, when you use a quantifier, since the domains have to be individuated, you've got to subscript it with a sortal. And this is taking us back substantially towards a term logic, that is, towards an Aristotelian logic rather than a Kant-Frege, a Kant Principia sort of logic. And indeed, that aspect of Frege's Grundgesetze is Kantian and Russellian in this regard. Now, Frege seems to think both that you can't count objects, you have to have identifying and individuating sortals for things to come under in order to count them, and identity is absolute. For any A and B, they either are identical or they're not. Identities are not sortally relative. The figure who has made the most sense of that, acknowledging the phenomena that Geach points to, and yet saying we can have absolute identity nonetheless, is John McDowell's undergraduate tutor, David Wiggins, in his masterwork, Sameness and Substance, where he shows, I would say, that you can have both of these claims, absolute identity, and acknowledge that the things that flank identity signs have to be individuated by sortals. How can those both be true? The human being who has worked out an actual logic of that so that it works is Anil Gupta in his Pitt dissertation, wrote with Belknap, that was published as his first book, The Logic of Common Nouns. So, if you're interested in this Geach sortal relativity, relativity of identity, subscripting of quantifiers to sortals, those are the two things I'd recommend you look at. The Wiggins, which is very good on the Aristotelian background of this and the connection between substance talk in early modern philosophy and these issues about sortals. I mean, I hope I've said enough to convince you that there are these deep connections, that if we want to think about sort of the ontological questions, that Frege is giving us tools that we absolutely need to use. Okay, now I've taken a couple of steps along Frege's path. I've rehearsed them here. There's this phenomenon that shows that there's a missing argument place, an unacknowledged relativity in how many questions, how many whats, that we're trying to fill with the notion of a unit, but that actually need to be filled with a with a concept, in a sense that will support there being a fact of the matter about whether a concept applies to a particular object. So whether there's water in the North Sea, that's something that does not depend on how we're drawing the boundaries around it. Second observation, not all concepts will do. Only concepts that isolate what falls under them in a definite and determinate manner, well, that's what Quine is articulating in terms of criteria of identity and individuation, as well as criteria of application. And at this point, he brings in another claim that he made right at the beginning of the Grundlagen. He said, if you ask anybody what a number is, their answer is liable to be, well, of course, it's a thing, an object. It's the sort of thing we talk about using numerals, using number expressions. And he says, in 62, I hope I put this on the handout. Well, we've already settled that number words are to be understood as standing for self-subsistent objects. Self-subsistent, selbstständige. That's his term for them being hexietes or countable. And that's enough to give us a class of propositions which must have a sense. He says Sinn, but he's not using it in his technical sense yet. Namely, those which express our recognition of a number as the same again. Now here, he's doing this unpacking with numbers, but that it stands for an object says that there's a certain kind of judgment that has to have a conceptual content. And that's a judgment that expresses the recognition of an object as the same again. Why? Well, it's implicit in, that's making explicit something that's implicit in being able to count. In order to count things properly, to get the right answer to the how many question, you have to be able to tell whether I've counted the same snake twice in this mess of them, as I'm trying to say how many snakes there are there. If I can't tell when I've got the same one again, when this snake is identical to that snake, then I can't count them. And what he's saying is that the judgment that expresses that sameness of content, and now I think we can just use that in the sense of section 8 from the Begriffsschrift, that is, intersubstitutable, saving all the goodness of all the implications, intersubstitutable salva consequentiae. It's the statements that express the recognition of an object as the same again. So that's going to be making explicit criteria of identity and individuation, or anyway. So again in 62, in our present case, this is numbers, but I'm saying think about it for the general case objects. To define the sense of a proposition, the number which belongs to the concept F is the same as the number which belongs to the concept G. That is to say, we may reproduce the content, the Inhalt, so he's telling us, go back to Begriffsschrift 3, where he defines that, of this proposition in other terms, avoiding the use of the expression, the number which belongs to the concept F. In doing this, we shall be giving a general criterion for the identity of numbers, criterion Kennzeichen, and that is the same word that Wittgenstein uses. When we have thus arrived at have acquired a means of arriving at a determinate number and of recognizing it as the same again, we can assign it a number word as its proper name. And I want to say, next week we'll talk about the number case, but he's saying, well, I need sortals for these numbers if they're going to be objects. What do I need? Well, these criteria of identity take the form of recognition judgments, judgments that express the recognition of an object as the same again. Now, here there is again an important historical strand that starts here that runs through Peter Strawson's book Individuals and everything that Gareth Evans ever wrote about what's involved in being able to recognize an object as the same again, and trying to understand now, in a way full circle, understand space and time in terms of abilities to recognize an object as the same again. So he introduces this idea of recognition statements. Let me just mention a central Hegelian concept is recognition. It's not the same word. This is Wiedererkennen, and that's Anerkennung. I would say, well, you shouldn't need to mention that because nobody's going to write an article on the concept of recognition in the Grundlagen and in the Phenomenology? Well, you might think so, but Robert Solomon, who I will never forgive for using up the title In the Spirit of Hegel for his Hegel book, but the first article that he wrote in his professional career is a comparison of the concept of satisfaction of a desire in Hegel and satisfaction of a formula in Tarski. And don't do that. Okay, so he has this idea of a recognition judgment. If we could understand the conceptual content of a recognition judgment, a judgment that was intelligible as expressing our criteria of identity and individuation of the sortal and applying it, then we'd know what objects are. Right? We'd know what sortal concepts are, we'd know what objects are. If we could understand the content of a recognition judgment, a judgment that we can understand as expressing our recognition of an object as the same again. Yeah, we're going to need non-recognition judgments or recognition of the non, anyway, too, but, okay. And what is it to understand the conceptual content of a judgment? Well, it's to get the begrifflich Inhalt, which is the inferential role of it. So, what is the inferential role of a judgment that expresses the recognition of an object as the same again? And here he makes the next move. He says, those are just identity claims. A equals B. So, again in 62, probably we're off the handout now, but it's in the passages that I selected that are on the website. To obtain the concept of a number, one must fix the sense of a numerical identity. Our aim is to construct the content of a judgment. We know what content means here, inferential role, which can be taken as an identity such that each side of it is a number. Again in 62, yeah. Okay. Section 62 is the most important one in the Grundlagen. Again there, when we have thus acquired a means of arriving at a determinate number and recognizing it again as the same, we can assign it a number word as its proper name. Eigennamen, singular term, I think. And then he makes another move. He says, what is the inferential role of identity statements? And this is in 65. I propose to adopt Leibniz's definition as my own definition of identity. It's actually the case that in universal substitutability, all the laws of identity are contained. Identity statements are intersubstitution licenses. He uses the word here, substitution, Ersetzbarkeit. He also uses vertreten to talk about substituting. I haven't ever detected a difference. I think he uses them interchangeably, but that's something I'll just alert you to, you can look for. In intersubstitutability, all the laws of identity are contained. That is, the inferential role played by an identity claim as, say, a premise in an inference is to claim that wherever one of the two terms appears, sorry, is to claim that if you've got an implication that's good, that substituting all occurrences of one of these terms for all occurrences of another of these terms will never turn it into a bad implication. So think how far he's come. He's given us the inferential role of identity statements, universal intersubstitution, that's what they license. Those are recognition judgments, that's what they express. Our recognition of a judgment as of an object as the same again, that's what you need to do in order to introduce a singular term as referring to an object. By object I just mean what singular terms talk about. So if you want to introduce a singular term that is as referring to an object, so properly introduce it, you need to fix the sense of the identities. You need to say which intersubstitution licenses does it produce. That's the content of it, and those are the criteria of adequacy for introducing a new term. And he's going to take that idea and say, well, now, how do we do that for number words, for numerals? Okay, but that's so far, this view is just about sortals, objects, and identity. I mean, we can put that by saying, well, you have to have specified criteria of identity and individuation, but he's got a more specific view. You have to have settled, you may not be able to tell, but you have to have settled the truth of a set of identities in order to introduce it. But if you do, then you've settled that there's an object, because that's what talking about objects is using terms that permit the identification of an object as the recognition of an object as the same again. Now, there's some things, some philosophical issues that we can clear up easily in this by using this idea, this set of ideas. I say this sequence of moves, each one of which is a remarkable step. But what about unit and object and particular, these transcendental concepts? The key thing to realize is they aren't sortals. You can't count things. How many things are on the desk? Well, is that shadow one of the things on the desk? Is the hole in it a thing on the desk? What about the top half of that thing? You can't count objects, things, particulars. Those aren't sortals. Well, what are they? Well, they're pseudo-sortals, or placeholders for sortals. Or, in many of their uses, they're prosortals. That is, they have an antecedent that tells you what the real sortal is. But to do anything where you use the notion of object, you have to put a real sortal in there. Talk about objects or units or unities, about things, about hexieties, is just a way of talking about of existentially quantifying over the sortals, saying, look, there is some sortal such that. And I've just put this placeholder in there so I don't need to tell you which one it is. Objects can be merely numerically distinct in the sense that we say, well, we don't care which sortal distinguishes them. Use some sortal so that you can count them. That's all that matters. That's the way to understand what Quine and Tarski are doing when they specify a domain, and say, well, it's a domain of objects. Say, well, what kind of objects? It doesn't matter. Okay, it doesn't matter, but it matters that there be someone. There has to be some way of identifying and individuating these things. And if you forget that, as Quine and Tarski do, then you get the metaphysical puzzles of saying, well, I understand what I'm talking about semantically in model theoretic terms, but there's always a Pythagorean model that only has numbers as the domain elements, doesn't use any of their properties as numbers except whether they're the same or different. So how am I supposed to understand model theoretically talking about anything other than numbers? If somebody says that's all you're really talking about, well, all the work of answering that is going to be done by the real sortals that you use in the meta vocabulary in order to specify an actual domain. That's the task that the medievals were using notions like hexiety and unity. Einheit it is the version Frege is using here, which means both unity and unit. And that is the Dedekind term. And we can see exactly what the confusion was that led to this profusion of scholastic metaphysics, looking for the property that things have in virtue of which they're countable, and using these terms that stand in for genuinely identifying and individuating things, which, as we see, can give very different answers. People and passengers, decks and cards, you can get different answers for those things. And the only way you're going to understand this is to think about the way the sortals work. So, we haven't gotten really to the part about numbers in the book. I'm going to claim next week, when we talk about the second half of the book, that it still isn't really about the numbers, that at that point the real topic is abstractions, introducing new terms by abstractions from old ones, that is, introducing new sortal terms from old sortal terms in a particular way. And what are the rules for doing that, such that you get the right to treat the abstract terms as genuine singular terms that pick out objects? He's got to solve that problem in order to be entitled to talk about numbers. But the problem he has to solve in order to be entitled to that is much broader than just the problem with numbers. So, I was in my introductory lecture a couple of weeks ago effusive in my praise for the philosophical moves made in this book, and I mean today to have been offering at least some cash for that promissory note. The sequence of analytic moves that he made here completely transformed, in my view, the philosophical tradition of identifying and individuating things, substances, or doing it spatiotemporally or whatever, doing it in sort of ontological and metaphysical terms, and the kind of knots that people tied themselves in, looking for how to talk about hexieties, how to talk about the unity that things have, that entities, ents, have. And after you use the meta-conceptual machinery that he's putting in place here, you've got to think about those debates very differently. I recommended the Wiggins book as one attempt, one good attempt to address a whole host of contentious metaphysical issues using this sort of machinery. To say, well, so to what extent is the lesson that Frege taught us here that we need substances, that we need the sortals, and substance talk was just a misleading way of talking about sortals and identity and so intersubstitution. So within Frege's overarching methodology of looking at inferential roles and then noting invariants of inferential roles under substitution, those are the big, the broad outlines of the framework. And look, he's giving us, I don't know, that could be my phone. He's giving us a framework for doing that, I don't know, I think casts that whole philosophical tradition in a very different light. There's the way it looked before Frege and the way it looked after, at least to anybody who sort of learned these lessons. And as I say, we're only halfway through the book. There's abstraction and actually numbers for next time. So if you haven't read these passages from 62 to the end of it, now you should be equipped to do it, and we'll talk about it next time.